piece of the 9/11 story from a person who lived through the terror will hopefully provide you with an understanding of the magnitude of the event and its place in history. As our guest today ran out into the street at the base of the World Trade Center complex, his life was forever changed. Today, he would like to share his story with you. Please welcome actor, author, playwright, and survivor, Artie Van Wy.
Thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much for being here. It means a lot to see that this many people have an interest in that day and remembering that day. There are countless stories of that day, stories that go beyond just the people who happen to be there. Anyone in the audience who is old enough to remember, you have a story of 9/11, of where you were. Mine is of no great significance. It just happens my story had me there in the streets that day. And it's still, all these years later, important for me to tell my story. For one, it's the one way, the one gift I have to contribute to the memory of all those who died, particularly the ones that I saw die. And it's the one thing I can contribute to try to assure that we as a country never forget that day. When I drove into New York City for the first time, which was in November of 1977, those towers were part of the skyline. They stood out, and they stood out majestically. You couldn't think of New York City without thinking of those Twin Towers. But the World Trade Center was more than just those Twin Towers. There were other buildings that surrounded it. There was a plaza in the middle of it. But to stand in that plaza and just look at those towers as they rose up was really breathtaking. This is the plaza I mentioned. It was right in the center between the two towers. That beautiful sculpture of the globe, the fountain, all the benches. In the summertime, it was such a wonderful place to be at lunchtime. More than likely, every day, if the weather was good, I would get my lunch and I'd sit on one of those benches and just enjoy the day, the sun, the sound of the water. What people don't realize is really the World Trade Center was somewhat a city in and of itself. Beneath the World Trade Center, there was a mall of shopping centers, restaurants, and then above ground, of course, the plaza, the buildings that surround it. My favorite building was building number 5. I'd go in there towards the end of my lunch hour, and it was a bookstore in there, and I would look through the books and look through the CDs. That's another view of just people sitting and enjoying it. And I often marveled as I sat there and I would watch the tourist. You know, it's very easy when you're a diehard New Yorker to make fun of the tourist, but those tourists gave me an appreciation of the World Trade Center, as you could just see the awe in their faces as they took their pictures and as they looked around. And one of the most regrettable things, I think, is that those of you who were young then will never get to experience what the World Trade Center was. It truly was, in my words, a glorious place. In the summertime, you'll notice there was a concert stage built. And at lunchtime, they would have free concerts. They'd have folding chairs much like these set up in front, And you could eat your lunch and sit there, and every day was a different form of entertainment. Doo-wop one day, jazz the other. For those of you who are old enough to remember, I sat through a concert of Peter Noone of Herman's Hermits, Mark Lindsay of Paul Revere and the Raiders, and I would just sit there and think, here I am in the middle of New York City, enjoying this concert, and what was fun when the music was up-tempo and upbeat, people would get up out of their chairs and kind of just start dancing. You know, secretaries with one another, or, you know, a straight-laced businessman. And it was just a very joyous, joyous atmosphere. The day of September 11th started out for me as every day did. I lived in Midtown Manhattan, 43rd Street. So I had to take the subway down to the World Trade Center. And as soon as I came up out of the subway onto the street, my first stop was at a coffee cart, much like this one. And I'd get my cup of coffee. It took about a week before the coffee vendor memorized how I liked my coffee. Half decaf, half regular, sweet and low, a little skim milk. And I no sooner would walk up to the cart and he had my coffee ready for me. And I'd pay him, and then I would go to the newsstand and pick up a newspaper. And after that, I would just sit on one of those benches, read the newspaper, drink my coffee, before I had to go up to work. And I remember that day, this was my office building. It was on the corner of Broadway and Fulton Streets, 195 Broadway. And you can see how close proximity it was to the North Tower. This also gives you more of an idea of where I was. The red is my office building. And you'll see there is the whole complex. World Trade Center Building 5, the building where I went in the bookstore. And then in yellow, the two towers, World Trade Center 1 and World Trade Center 2. If you ask anybody who was in New York that day, or even on the East Coast, the one common thing you will hear is people saying how beautiful that day was. The sky was the most beautiful blue I think I had ever witnessed. The clouds stunning. And it was one of those days where you just kind of sit there and you have that sense of life is good, you know? And so 8:30 came, time for me to get to work, so I went up to my office building. And I'd been working in my office for about 15 minutes. And then everything changed. The first plane hit the North Tower. In my office, we heard the explosion, and our building actually shook. And everyone was saying, you know, what was that? Was that thunder? Was that an explosion? And it didn't take too long before someone ran into the office, a secretary who was hysterical, saying, a plane has hit one of the towers. Well, my first initial response, I thought she meant a very small plane, like a single prop plane had probably crashed into the tower. I didn't expect that. So, mostly out of curiosity, I went into the elevator bank and went down to the lobby. And I walked through that revolving door, stepping out into the street. And that shows, that's where I came out, where that yellow arrow is, on Day Street. And the first thing I noticed was paper everywhere. The streets were covered with sheets of paper. And sheets of paper were just wafting down constantly from the sky. Paper from the offices that had been in the North Tower. I followed that. I walked that yellow line to Church Street, right in front of the World Trade Center. And again, noticing all the paper that was there. And I started to notice pieces of debris and like plasterboard. So I walked, and for the first time when I looked up to the tower, expecting to see that little plane, this is what I witnessed. And people often ask me, well, what was going through your mind then? I don't know. It was absolute shock. I say I went through that revolving door, and for me personally, going through that door, as I went through, I was leaving the life I knew, the life I had, and stepping out into a different world and a different life. I stepped out into a war zone, and I had had no combat training. So I had no words, no thoughts that could adequately process what I was seeing. It was like a black canyon, and flames and smoke just billowing out of it. By that time, more people were coming out, and the streets were lined, and everyone, myself, just staring. And I don't know if you can tell, but we started noticing that people were on the other floor, or on the upper floors, and the looks of shock. These few pictures can only begin to describe what it was like for those of us in the streets watching this unfold. And we noticed the people. I'll never forget seeing people waving shirts or whatever from those upper floors, the floors above that black canyon, the floors where people were trapped. And we're just so hoping someone see me, help me. We just stared at that, and then I heard a woman behind me scream. And I looked closely and saw that people were starting to jump from the North Tower. And I show you these not to be graphic, but to give you a sense of what we were seeing. We were seeing people who knew they were going to die. And these people had to make a choice. They were going to decide how they died, either by fire or by jumping. And to this day, I consider those people the most courageous people to make that choice. There is a quote, two quotes actually, that are etched on the walls of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, talking particularly about those who ended their lives by jumping. One man said, "She had a business suit on. Her hair was askew. This woman stood there for what seemed like minutes. Then she held down her skirt and then stepped off the ledge. I thought, how human, how modest to hold down her skirt before she jumped. I couldn't look anymore." Someone else described, "You felt compelled to watch out of respect to them. They were ending their life without a choice, and to turn away from them would have been wrong."